Welcome everyone. Centennial of cinema in Turkey. Okay, 1914 Turkey. Let's start with it. Was there a Turkey by then? This is our first question, obviously. If we are talking about the Republic of Turkey, then the answer is clear. It wasn't there to be found. So there are two running arguments, cross-current arguments that I will try to kind of put out over my talk. One is about multiple modernities and the multiplicity of history of early cinema especially. And the second one is about missed encounters. So those two things will go. I will start with a typical Yeşilçam film. For those of you who are not aware of the history of cinema in Turkey, roughly, we can say that there is an early cinema period which started in the Ottoman Empire and which continued in the Republican era, early Republican era also. And then there is a Yeşilçam period. Yeşilçam, it literally translates as green pine. It is the name of a street right off of İstiklal Street in Beyoğlu, Pera. And the industry is named after that street because starting from late 1940s, a lot of the production companies were located on or around that street. So to this day, still the street is named as Yeşilçam. But not anymore. You can find a lot of production companies over there because the industry, Yeşilçam industry, or the popular filmmaking industry of what we can call as the Turkish cinema instead of cinema in Turkey. Because I take cinema in Turkey as a more umbrella term, which includes not only the films made in the Republic of Turkey, but during the Ottoman era, or nowadays films made by migrant Turks, migrant Kurds, nowadays film made by Kurds living in Turkey. So if you name the cinema in Turkey as cinema in Turkey, it's kind of used more as an umbrella term which includes different identities, different ethnicities under it. Whereas Yeşilçam cinema itself, which was mostly popular roughly from 1950 to 1990, so the beginning and end of Yeşilçam, you can put minus or plus a few years from roughly, you can locate it around 1950 to 1990. And it's similar to, let's say, classical Hollywood cinema.
50 or 50?
Yeah, 50. 1950 and 1990. Classical Hollywood cinema, for instance, it started after the introduction of sound film. In late 1920s, it started roughly around 1930, and those films went on till the rise of New Hollywood, the films of those highly coveted figures ranging from Spielberg to Scorsese to Coppola, all those guys. They started making their films in late 1960s and early 70s, so classical Hollywood cinema is roughly from 1930 to 1960. Classical Turkish cinema, if you would like to call it like that, as popular cinema of Turkey or as Yeşilçam of Turkey, you can say that it started around 1950 and it ended around 1990. What happened since 1990? We have a new world of cinema in Turkey, which is separate from that previous era. Because in this new world of cinema in Turkey, you have a lot of non-Turkish directors working in the industry. At times you have a lot of Turkish directors working abroad. You have a lot of co-productions. So, the contemporary world of cinema in Turkey is either called as post-Yeşilçam or as the new cinema of Turkey. So, you can take one of these as your cues to explain a shift from Turkishness toward a more multiple identity or ethnicity related framework. So basically, very early Yeşilçam's history, it was not that much of a national cinema. Contemporary cinema in Turkey, it is national, but not yet very much national. But roughly from 1950 to 1990, you can talk about a national cinema in Turkey, or quote-unquote a Turkish cinema in Turkey. So this is interesting because I'm a film historian at the end of the day, and I work on the history of a national film industry. That is the industry in Turkey, and you deal with such problems when you are writing national histories, because you can write film histories in different respects, and you can find a lot of books titled, okay, history of Italian cinema, history of French cinema, history of Indian cinema. So when you create that kind of a national rubric, you have to also deal with what you mean by it. This is why I wanted to make that explanation at the forefront in relation to what we mean by Turkish cinema or cinema in Turkey, because recently a lot of the filmmakers in Turkey started also talking about something called Türkiye sineması, cinema of Turkey, instead of Türk sineması, Turkish cinema. This is why they are talking about it. They're taking it more as an umbrella term, and under it there are different films produced by different ethnicities, different languages, etc., etc. So this is one argument that would be all around multiplicity of the history which existed in Turkey in terms of cinema. The second one is our relation to Yeşilçam cinema, especially contemporary audiences' relation to Yeşilçam cinema. And very often what you find over there, because it is an old classical era, because it's mostly determined by three genres: melodramas, action films, and comedies. And because a lot of those films, all of them, were melodramatic in their tone. Melodramatic meaning in this case not as a genre particularly, but as kind of a phantom genre, as a mode of narration which entered into the vocabulary of the majority of the films made in Turkey in those 4 decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, in which the Manichaean conflict, the conflict between the pure evil and pure good, is always resolved with the pure good winning over the pure evil. And by this way proposing a set of morality to the audiences, very similar to the morality that could have been proposed by a religious discourse. So, and these films, when we deal with those films, there is also an aspect of nostalgia and memory. Nostalgia of an old Turkey, nostalgia of a quote-unquote pure, more moral looking, etc., type of Turkey, as if the contemporary Turkey is totally immoral, bad. We kind of created that kind of a nostalgic feeling about those films, which is not the case. Obviously, every period of the history has its own virtues and vices, and yet our relation to the past, especially our relation to the past through those Yeşilçam films, is a nostalgic one which presumes that that past was more kind of pure, like our childhood. This is kind of a relationship that we constructed. So I want to start with this, and this national, or to some extent nationalist narrative of those Yeşilçam popular films are quite easily found by many different scholars or critics working on those films and everything. Yet there are other things in those films. I just want to start with one film from 1963 or 64, I think, if my memory serves me right, called Seven Kadın Unutmaz. The lover woman wouldn't forget. Alright, that would be my literal translation. I will just show you the opening of it. The film opens in Izmir. With two great stars, Türkan Şoray and this one. So now, I'm just asking you to focus on the looks and everything. The play around the looks also at the same time. Starting. Everything is told to you in the first 5 to 10 seconds, basically. I mean, you got the story, you know the story from this point on. But look at the looks, it's kind of very well done. I think you are scared a lot. Would you like some water? I'm sorry, it's my fault.
İkimize de kabahat var. Siz dalgındınız, ben de size dalmıştım.
So I am sorry if wherever you are going, I would like to drop you. She says, I'm working right over here, and she leaves. This look is my cue. This kind of... Anyways, as you see in this look, there is some uncertainty. They have an encounter, yet they are missing a further encounter. I just want to play around that trope of encounter, two eyes meeting each other and then missing each other. Because when we talk about the history or centennial of cinema in Turkey, which is supposed to be this year, it's all about also a missed encounter. I opened up this talk saying that it's the centennial, but 100 years ago was there a Turkey? Was there the Republic of Turkey? This is the first missed encounter. And there are a few other missed encounters. So the supposed first movie made in Turkey is called The Demolition of the Russian Monument in Hagia Stephanos. So it's an interesting history. It's very interesting. Do you have any idea where Hagia Stephanos is? Yeah, current day area of the airport. In 1878, the Russians, when they came very close to Istanbul, when they were about to basically invade the Ottoman capital, they constructed a church, a monument, sorry, not a church, over there. So this monument is an interesting building. It was destroyed in 1914. Why 1914? Because the empire decided to enter the First World War, siding with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and against the Russians. Obviously, one of the first things that was done was the destruction of the monument. As the story goes, there is an Austrian company called Savaş, Filmgesellschaft, which was later on moved to Germany. It was started by an Austrian baron by the name of Savaş. So a crew from that company, because the Ottomans were allies at the time with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an Austrian film crew came over to Istanbul. As they were destroying this monument, Fuat Özkınay, who is generally accepted as the first ethnically Turkish filmmaker in the empire, supposedly shot the film. But Fuat Özkınay over here in this picture, but not at that instant, later on. As the story goes, he kind of pressed the button and he just pressed the stop button at the end. That was his kind of experience with the camera. So the camera was owned by the Austrians at the time, and there were their film crew, their cameraman and everyone who were present over there. So Prof took the film, but then missed the encounter. What is missing is the film is nowhere to be found. There are no copies of the film surviving. What we have are those 4 or 5 pictures remaining from there, and somebody did an animation of those 4 or 5 pictures. So had the film had survived, this could have been it. Or this could have been similar to this. So, not here, not here. And if this is Prof's eye. This is an animation of photographs of the demolition of the monument. That's about it. Should we start the history of a cinema with a demolition? Now this is our question. Should we do that? Should we accept this date as the centennial? There are arguments among film critics, among film historians.
Especially since it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, the copy is nowhere to be found. It's all about a missed encounter. Everything is missing. I mean, you cannot put the pieces of the puzzle together and make a good narrative out of it. But perhaps this is the narrative of the formation of a nation at that time. You can find it kind of metaphorically telling in many respects this kind of a story. So what else was going on by then? And why we are talking about multiple modernities and everything? So there are 2 brothers, Yanaki and Milton Manaki. Manaki or Manakia, it depends. So those brothers are black. Blacks are a small population who are still to this day living in current day Romania. So they are blacks from Romania. Then they lived in Macedonia. What else? Then they also lived in Greece. If you go to Greece, 1907, Carpet Weaving Girl, the first film of Greece, is accepted to be the Manaki brothers film. If you go to Macedonia, 1907, Carpet Weaving Girls, the first Macedonian film. Then there were some also Turkish film critics and film historians who said that these guys in 1911 and 1912 shot what? Shot the Sultan Mahmud V. So, Sultan Mehmet V, Sultan Mehmet Reşat, while he was visiting Bitola and Manastır.
So shot meaning shoot with a camera?
Yeah, they should. I'm sorry, pardon the language, kind of for me it's kind of quite normal shooting a film and they shot the Sultan. Okay, so they filmed the Sultan. We are talking about 2 Ottoman citizens shooting or filming the Sultan, filming their own Sultan in 1911. Should we take this as the first Turkish film? How would we place that identity? And let me show you some of those images. you see the quality is not good and everything. I think you got the idea. I also kind of just
Yes.
started here. So, some said that, okay, we should accept these as the first films. Then the centennial, the anniversary, all those things would change. This is kind of, in many ways, I find all these interesting moments to start with, because they also talk about how you would define what is Turkey, what is Turkishness, and everything. So, there are other things going on in relation to the first screenings, not the first films filmed by Ottoman or Turkish citizens, but the first film screenings in Turkey, or in the Ottoman Empire, or in Istanbul. So, late December 1895, first Lumiere films were screened to public in Paris. Yeah. Then, roughly 1 year later, in 1896, first public screening of films in Turkey were done at a place called Sponek, which is generally translated as the Sponek Beer Hall, or the Sponek Cafeteria, that kind of a place it was. It was on Istiklal Street. And the place was by then a part of Pera, obviously, the kind of non-Muslim Istanbul. 1896 population of Istanbul was roughly between 900,000 to 1 million, and half of the population was non-Muslim. So we are talking about a very different picture of Istanbul than we can imagine today. And before that, there was a private screening at the Yıldız Palace. The Yıldız Palace screening was done for the daughters of Sultan Abdülhamid II. Ayşe Osmanoğlu, in her memories, talks about that. But it was because it was a private screening, it wasn't accepted as the real first public screening. So, Pera, the first screening. Then, the year after, there were other screenings at a place which I find more interesting and more informative about the contemporary history of Turkey. There were other screenings at the Fevziye Coffee House, Fevziye Kıraathanesi, in the old city of Istanbul, in Fatih. Fevziye Kıraathanesi used to be a place of gathering among the Ottoman intellectuals, and during the Ramadan month there were different performances and theatrical shows, especially shadow play shows and everything that were taking place. And the screenings over there at the Fevziye Kıraathanesi were done on a Karagöz screen. Now, this is an interesting thing. You have, like on those top two examples, you have a shadow play setting. And over there you are screening films. This is kind of, once again, metaphorically quite telling about what we understand as cinema in Turkey, or what we can talk about as cinema in Turkey. Why so? Because on the one side, in shadow plays, you have a whole history of traditional performance, which goes back to Indonesia, to Java, which is related to animistic religions, shamanism, which then traveled through, most probably, Arab traders to Egypt, and through Egypt arrived at the Ottoman Empire. So, shadow plays, all that thing, is a huge different history of performance, which has right next to it a magical background, an animistic background. Because you see shadows, and the master of shadow plays is called as Hayali, master of dreams, imaginations, master of phantoms, ghosts, whichever way you would like to call. So this is one side, and the shadow play screen, the light source is behind the screen. So it's a totally different regime of seeing and representation. Whereas in cinema, you have the projection, like in this setup over here, in front of the screen. This is quite interesting for us. Why so it's interesting? Because it brings together two separate traditions, two separate histories. The photographic camera and film camera. It has a whole history behind itself which goes back to Renaissance perspective. With the introduction of the rules of perspective, with the introduction of an illusion created on a two-dimensional space of our three-dimensional world. And an illusion which is conditioned, which has a system of merging lines, as you see, as illustrated in the Last Supper by Da Vinci over here. System of merging lines, vanishing point, a whole system of representation which later on turned into, as you see below, into camera obscura, and then later on turned into photographic camera on top right, and then the film camera down right. So this is a way of seeing, this is a way of history, which in miniature paintings, in the visuality and vocabulary of miniature paintings, the Ottomans didn't have, because it's a totally different way of understanding the world and way of representing the world on a two-dimensional surface. Because at the core of the Western perspectival vision is an analogical representation of the world. As for instance, Roland Barthes says, you are talking about a veritable ontology, an ontology of the world, which is put in an image and which can be, especially thanks to the photographic camera, verified, which has a claim of truth to itself based on the rules of optics, because we think that photographic camera is reproducing reality mechanically, and therefore it's objective in many respects. And this also goes for the film camera. So representing or imitating life in reality and real way. Whereas in miniature paintings, this optical, observational or visual realism is replaced by something else. It's replaced by a narrative realism. You have to stick to the story in miniature paintings. Then you have to stick to how we see or the rules of optics. You have to stick to the importance of the characters of your story. And therefore, when those two things come together, this small quote over here is from John Berger, who came to Istanbul, who saw a painting by Şeker Ahmet Pasha, down right, the painting, woodcutter in the forest. And very interestingly, who said that this is a product of a different way of seeing than the Western way of seeing. Şeker Ahmet Pasha, he was an Ottoman military painter who was sent by the Ottoman army to France to education. He worked with Courbet and others, and he worked under their studios. And top right images are two landscapes from Courbet, Gustave Courbet. Just by comparison, I want to put them on top so that you can have an idea with regard to the comparison with Şeker Ahmet Pasha painting. So what you see in Gustave Courbet paintings and what you don't have in Şeker Ahmet Pasha painting is the application of perspective. Because when you look at the right-hand side of the Şeker Ahmet Pasha painting, the thing you see on the right-hand side, it looks like a hill. But is it a hill? It's actually not a hill. When you look on the left-hand side of the picture, and you follow the path which goes through the bridge and everything, you understand that it is not a hill. But if you start looking at from right-hand side of the painting, it tells us a very different story. Then there are three trees in the painting. The left-hand side tree looks like as if it is in the foreground, middle tree is in the middle ground, and the tree in the back looks like it's in the background. But in a normal perspectival painting, what you would have is, you would have a difference in terms of the sizes of the trees. Because the tree in the background is furthest away from us, and normally its trunk must be smaller by comparison to the frontal trees. But if you think perspectively, then this tree in the background, it must be really huge by size. And if you compare the size of the woodcutter with those trees, it's only a different story. The woodcutter is very small and the forest is too big. Berger talks about that, saying that actually the woodcutter looks like as if he is devoured by the forest, because the forest is so big and everything. And therefore Şeker Ahmet Paşa might be representing, he says, the experience of the woodcutter in the forest. The woodcutter who is dwarfed by the trees, who is rendered very small. So this is kind of the difference. When you are trained, or when you are trained in one way of seeing, when you grow up through one regime of seeing, which is the miniature, and then you learn another way of seeing, and you combine them, you create a very different combination. So this is a multiplicity that I will take as an advantage of the way of seeing in the cinema of Turkey, especially that of Yeşilçam, which is used by many different things. Then yet, we have another thing in relation to Turks that I want to talk about, the image of the Turk as it has appeared. This is a machine called as the Turk. This is a chess machine. And this chess machine is created by a Hungarian baron. And it basically functions through trickery. Inside the machine there is a person who operates a chess machine. And it was a kind of interesting thing over the 19th century at different royal palaces or at different aristocrat mansions. A robot playing chess against human beings and everything. So, but the chess is all worked through trickery, and it is named as the Turk. This is another thing which is interesting in terms of the image of the Turk, or what you take as Turk. Because we are talking about the first Turkish film, and over there I have a very nice story. A film that is supposedly shot by a Turkish army officer, but a film that is lost, a film that is nowhere to be found. So all this story of kind of trickery, all this story of stuff that is supposed to have happened, yet you cannot verify in your contemporary reality, is at stake. And the other side of this idea of the Turk working through trickery, working through Turkification is one of the tropes I use in relation to both Turkish modernization and also at the same time cinema in Turkey, especially that of Yeşilçam cinema, because I mean, when you deal with Yeşilçam films, okay, I will just write one thing. If I write down Turkish Star Wars, for instance, some films do come out to mind and we have a nice smile on our faces and everything. So, a lot of Yeşilçam films, roughly, if there are around 6,000 films made from late 40s to early 1990s, altogether there are over 7,000 films made in the feature films I'm talking about, by the way, made in the history of Turkey. You can easily say that 20 to 30% of those films of the Yeşilçam era are remakes, rip-offs of Hollywood films or other Western films. And when we just say that Turkish Star Wars, all the visual effects are low quality, everything looks bad, you feel like it's so simplistic and everything. So this stone must be really heavy, but it's whether it is like that or not is kind of. And this is also a different planet than ours. I mean, low quality visual effects, low quality filmmaking, all sounds funny to our eyes. But where does this come from? When I thought about it, or when I also thought about, as you speak with those filmmakers and the audiences who went to film theaters and everyone in the 60s, 70s, they didn't find those films as funny as we are finding them today. So it's an interesting question. Why they didn't find it funny, but why we are finding them funny? Because our eyes, our vision, our film culture is conditioned by Hollywood. We are used to high quality special effects. We are used to a way of seeing. We are used to a vocabulary of filmmaking. Whereas these audiences, back then, they were not necessarily sharing the same vocabulary, but instead, as I showed in this curriculum, they were exposed to different traditional forms of performance, like shadow plays, like theater in the round. Theater in the round, that picture on the right, bottom right, would tell you a lot of stuff. Why so? Because theater in the round is a theater performance without props, without set, without anything. And over there you see only one table or chair, and that's about it. And when they said, okay, this chair is an airplane, it was an airplane. When they said, this chair is a house, it was a house. So you didn't kind of care much about the visual truth, or imitational, or analogical reality of what you had seen. As long as those were cued for you as real, as normal, it was taken to be totally normal. So, in the background of the history of cinema in Turkey, this is another multiplicity that we can take right next to each other. That is the multiplicity of regimes of representation, or multiplicity of the ways of seeing. A way of seeing coming from one performance, yet another one coming from another performance, another one coming from miniature paintings. So when you combine all those things, you reach to a different set of multiplicity. This is why I mean kind of I put out those maps to show us how our vision is conditioned nowadays, how there are possible visions that would counter our normal vision. The one you are seeing on top is not a funnily proportioned map of the world. It's a true map of the world. The world is like that, not like we are used to seeing on maps. And interestingly enough, in this map you see that Africa is quite large, South America is quite large. The size of Africa, bottom right, it includes, as you see, many countries which look, in our eyes, large. So, way of seeing, way of representing. North is dominant, West is dominant, and we are used to all these ways of seeing. But when we are dealing with the history of cinema in Turkey, we are dealing with a Western medium which arrived in Turkey, but which is subjected to many different regimes of seeing, performance and everything. Therefore, we have to shift our view in understanding the history of cinema in Turkey and understanding the history of, in general, arts which were produced in the later Ottoman Empire and during the Republican period. This is why over here I'm just kind of talking about multiple modernities instead of modernization theories or dependency theories. In sociology or in social science in general, modernization or dependency theories assume that non-Western states must follow a preset linear route of progression toward modernization. Hence, we have the categories of developed countries, underdeveloped countries, or developing countries, newly emerging countries, etc., etc., etc. It goes. In all of them, there is an ideal, there is a model, which is the West, and the West is something to be reached, something to be aimed at. Yet, alternatively, there were a lot of social sciences or theory studies coming from Zygmunt Bauman, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Marshall Berman. They all started talking about the multiplicity of modernity, the plurality of modernity and everything. So, according to those arguments, we don't have one single modernity. We don't have one single model modernity. But there are different modernities. So, have modernities started within the West? Not necessarily. There are different modernities and there are alternative routes to modernity. So, are now Western modernities necessarily a result of the Western one? Not necessarily. Are tradition and modernity mutually exclusive? This is what we are taught to. I mean, everything, as I was going to school, in my primary school education and everything, what I learned was, everything Ottoman was old, traditional, everything Republican was new, modern. But when I look at the history of cinema in Turkey, when I look at those films, what I saw is a combination of old and new, a combination of tradition and modernity. So then, when you start digging up that history and everything, you see that at the core, at the beginning of it, there are many modernities which were cross-currently running at the source. There wasn't a single modernity, there wasn't a single identity, but the identities and modernities were multiple. So, just to give you some examples, these are from the city columns. These were from the columns written by Ahmet Rasim, roughly between 1897 and 1899, about Istanbul, about city life in Istanbul, and it was published in a daily. And city rumors type of the thing, talk of the city type of the thing, that were written down over here. What's interesting over there is the top quote, they asked what is the difference between the tunnel and the tram. And the answer was, one goes in the dark but not goes over people, but the other goes in the light but it doesn't see whoever comes in front of it. One thing. Another, the down bottom one, what is the big difference between Anatolian and European trains? In one of them, you have conductors, train conductors with fez. In the other, you have train conductors with hat. 1897, 1898 we are talking about. So, figures of modernity, tropes of modernity I see over there. Changing from train to tunnel to tram. So if I'm going to talk about a Turkish modernity in terms of life, in terms of the speed of life, in terms of the culture of the city and everything, I can start talking about it over there. And there was modernity, which once we had, and then which we culturally kind of in our memories forgot about. Therefore, through that connection, hat and fez one train conductor, another train conductor. They are living at the same time, they are existing at the same time. This is kind of an interesting trope about Turkish modernity for us. Sakallı Celal, the figure on the bottom left, he has a kind of quite famous saying which informs what has happened in the Republican era very often. The so-called intellectuals of Turkey think that they are westernized as they run toward the west on a boat sailing eastward. So this is the multiplicity of your modernity. Your boat sails eastward, but you run on it toward the west, and this is your experience of westernization in many cases. Yet, if we get our information from those city letters, if we get our information from the early cinema of Turkey and everything, you see a lot of the elements of modernity happening at the same time with other European capitals, happening at the same time with other parts of the world. So therefore, we are conditioned to think through the West, but this West is a limit. The West is precisely what designates itself to it, as demarcation, even when it ceaselessly pushes back the frontiers of its imperium. So then, whenever the West opens toward the world, it creates a closure, says Jean-Luc Nancy, the French philosopher. This closure is named in many ways: appropriation, fulfillment, signification, destination. In particular, it is named representation, he says. Representation is what determines itself by its own limit. Because I am dealing with cinema, I am dealing with representation at the end of the day. Cinema is all about the representation of reality, a representation in moving images on a two-dimensional screen as a projected image coming from a light source. The projection is coming from a light source and everything. So this representation is all about limits. And what is beyond the limit is what is also behind the screen. The shadow plays, theater in the round, what we had not seen so far in many respects. This is why this history is multi-layered and it's interesting in many different ways. Okay, one more thing about early cinema. This is the poster for Sultan Mehmet V's voyage or visit to Macedonia. As you see, it's a poster handed out in Istanbul. Look at the languages. This multiplicity we are talking about. You have Greek, you have Armenian, you have Ottoman, Turkish, and you have French. Now, this is a totally different imagination of daily life, of modern life. And if I'm going to find a source for cinema, if I'm going to talk about the centennial of cinema in these lands, what is more interesting for me is to point out to these multiplicities. Because cinema, modern medium of representation. City life, modern life. You have trains, trams, all those tropes going on. Multiplicity, nowadays we love to call some cities as global cities, harboring different populations and everything. By then, the word for these kind of cities were cosmopolitan. So, cosmopolitan, you have it. Multiplicity, many languages, you have it. Modern, you have it. So this was the birth of cinema in Turkey instead of the 1914 birth of cinema in Turkey, which is all about a missed encounter, because the film is missing itself. So, whereas in these cases we have the films, and it is perhaps nicer to talk about all those films. Then this multiplicity left its place to Yeşilçam. As I said at the beginning, Yeşilçam was more Turkified, Yeşilçam was more kind of nationalistic, monolingual, monoreligious. It lost its multicultural, multi-confessional, multilingual aspects, which it had inherited from the empire. And as it lost them, it didn't lose all of them. It combined two ways of seeing. It combined different senses of realism. It combined elements from Western cinema. It took freely from Hollywood films. It renewed them, it used them, and it recreated them. Therefore, to understand the popular industry of cinema in Turkey, you have to say, on the one side, it looks very aggressive, very nationalistic. Yet on the other side, it is very multiple, very different in terms of its way of seeing or in terms of its vocabulary in comparison to the Western popular cinemas. And as I started digging up for that, I found that, like the miniatures, like the difference between miniatures. On the one hand, you have in Western painting an optical realism, a visual realism based on perspective. On the other hand, in miniatures, you have a narrative realism. So the realism of popular films in Turkey is also different from the realism of Western films. It's also different from not only Hollywood films, it is different from, say, neo-realist films of Italian cinema. So when we talk about, top 10 Turkish films and everything, one of the films you would be talking about would be that film featuring Yılmaz Güney called Hope, Umut. When they make lists and everything, very often film critics, film audiences in Turkey choose that film as one of the top 10 films, and it's accepted as kind of a perfect, kind of social realistic or neo-realistic film made in Turkey in early 1970s by Yılmaz Güney. But when I looked at this film and when I looked at this behind-the-scenes shot of the film, it's very interesting. There is a very different practice of filmmaking you can see over here. Yılmaz Güney, on the left-hand side, was the actor and also the director of the film. He was also the writer of the film. So, what he does is, he's acting in a scene in the film, but in the meantime, he's directing his cameraman. And not only would you see in the production of a Hollywood film set something like that, I have my own suspicions about it. If you look at the bottom left picture of Yılmaz Güney, it is from a film called The Wall, which was shot when he was in exile in France, and this was his last film. So in the film is about a children's prison and the life of children in a prison. And in one of the scenes of the film, the children are supposed to cry, but they are not crying because all those children were the children of migrant Turkish or Kurdish workers living in Europe at the time. They were not actors, actresses, whatever. So to make them cry, Yılmaz Güney did what? As you see, as the director of the film, he beat them up. Now, you wouldn't expect something like that in a Western film set. But this is also telling. Why so telling? This is kind of the realism that is going on over here. Because when you go back to 60s and 70s, some actors who portrayed evil characters in films, they were beaten up on the street also. And we have all those stories, we know all those stories. Why? why were they beaten up on the street? Why there is this kind of a practice going on? Because the understanding of realism as a representation of practice is different in the case of Yeşilçam filmmakers in comparison to European filmmakers. How is it different? In a Western theater or in this kind of a setting, theatrical setting, there is a separation between the stage and the auditorium. Whereas in this kind of a theatrical setting, there is no separation between the stage and the auditorium. In other words, there is not a clear-cut separation between reality and fiction. There are cross-currents running between reality and fiction. So the realism of films are also informative about the realities of life in many respects. There is not a clear separation between reality and the illusion of it, reality and the fiction of it. Therefore, there are different practices. Visual realism is not very much at stake. Narrative realism is at stake. This is why people take those stories seriously and they do things based on those stories in their real lives. So, these are kind of the interesting aspects of Yeşilçam. What happened in our cases in terms of Yeşilçam, it was two-dimensional in many respects. It wasn't high quality special effect based, very nice filmographically type of filmmaking. It inherited from miniatures two-dimensionality in many respects. It is oral tradition based. A lot of Yeşilçam films cue action with speech. Instead of showing me going out of this room, in a Yeşilçam film, the actor says before going out of the room, the actor very often says, I am going out of the room. And then he or she goes out. You cue your action with speech before you act on the screen. So oral tradition background, you have that. It is experiential, like the experience of the woodcutter we are talking about. It has all those elements in itself. You experience your life, and this is why you go out on the street and beat up also the villain of the film. And it is unlikely, very different in terms of its vocabulary, in terms of its surprises. That missed encounter scene I showed you at the beginning, it's very unlikely. This scene from this particular frame that I borrowed from a film called Hayat bazen tatlıdır, life is sometimes sweet. It's also yet another unlikely thing you can find in the vocabulary of Yeşilçam cinema. On the right hand side you have Kadir Savun. In the middle you have Saadettin Erbil, father of Mehmet Ali Erbil. And on the left hand side you have Zeki Müren. Now when I said Zeki Müren, for people who know about Zeki Müren, the picture has changed a lot. Because of his sexual tendencies which are known by everyone, but which are not yet admitted by anyone and everything. Yet he is known as the Pasha, the general of Turkish culture and music in many respects. You have films like that also, popping out from here and there. Unlikely films, unlikely scenes, which you would be surprised to see. So, because modernities are multiple, realities are also multiple, realisms and representations, modes of representation are multiple also at the same time. Therefore, Yeşilçam's mode of representation is not realistic in the way of the Western cinema at all times. Instead, it's a combination of two things, like the first screening at Fevziye Coffee House, which combined two screens together, screen of shadow play and screen of reality, screen of cinema. You have those two things going on at the same time in relation to Yeşilçam films. Okay, I think that's roughly all I'm going to talk about. One kind of quick note, for contemporary audiences, these films do not mean in the same way because after 1990s, in late 80s and early 90s, cinema in Turkey went into a huge crisis. The number of films made, it was 300 in 1972 per year. It went down to 20-25 in 1990. 20, 25. It's like there are more films made, but they were not shown at film theaters. 1990. It's kind of, the turning period is roughly from 1988 to 1993 or so. And during that time, almost all theaters were preoccupied by Hollywood films, and a new generation grew up watching only Hollywood films. And they lost, if you ask me personally, most probably, they lost their connection to those traditional forms of performance and traditional ways of seeing during that time. So that right now we are talking about a new cinema in Turkey. We are talking about the end of Yeşilçam industry and a totally new way of seeing and everything. In terms of films which are made since the last 2 decades or so, roughly. So those are different films. And because they are different, we have to have a different set of vocabulary to deal with them and everything. Unlike Yeşilçam, this is why we separate 3 periods. Yeşilçam period is more kind of singular, whereas early Yeşilçam, pre-Yeşilçam, the period before Yeşilçam, and the period after Yeşilçam is more multiple in many different respects. Thank you very much.